I wanted to offer a little public service announcement for everyone here about the digital LSAT changes that are coming. March and June LSATs are going to be 100% paper and pencil, as they always have been. But starting in July, things are going to change. Half of all test takers will get the paper and pencil format, but half will get the digital format, and LSAC chooses for you, and you don't get any advance notice. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want to be taking the LSAT under those circumstances. So I would say maybe avoid July if you want to, if you can. But one small benefit about the July LSAT is that you'll be able to see your score before canceling. This is a one-time opportunity that LSAC is giving July test takers kind of as a consolation prize for having to be the guinea pigs on that one. Then starting with September, everyone's getting digital 100%. Now, the digital LSAT has some pros and it has some cons. The pros, maybe you like that it's easy to highlight and underline things and that maybe it's a cleaner interface. The downside, though, is that you can't draw on the screen. That's probably the biggest thing I don't like about the digital LSAT. So if your LSAT logical reasoning strategy involves drawing on the paragraph, drawing on the argument text, just know that will not be available to you. You will get scrap paper, of course, but it's not really the same experience as being able to draw on the screen. You will be able to highlight and underline the arguments and the passages on the digital LSAT with their tool, but you won't be able to do it yourself. So that is something that you should consider and orient your prep around. So that's your quick PSA on the digital LSAT. One thing I can talk about is the difference between logical reasoning and the other sections when it comes to pacing. So, and the order in which you approach questions. Logic games and reading comprehension passages, of course, they've got something unique about them, which is that they're grouped. So when you do one question, you're making an investment that pays off with all the other questions. And so that's a benefit of games and passages. Logical reasoning, on the other hand, the questions are bite-sized. And so the benefit there is that you can jump around. Whatever happens in one question does not have to affect what happens in a later question. But as you may know, it does. If you are stuck on a tough question, even if you move on from it, you might still be thinking about the previous question when you're on the new one, and that's not doing you any favors, of course. So I want to talk a bit about pacing and how you handle this. When you come across a tough question and you're not making any headway on it, just skip it, flag it, come back to it later. The new digital LSAT actually has a feature where you can flag questions, so that's kind of cool. But if not, paper and pencil, just draw a little asterisk, a little marking, a star, next to that question so you know to come back to it later. Now, you might ask, well, how do I know I'll have time to come back? Well, first off, even if you don't have enough time to come back, that's okay. No big deal. That was a question you were probably going to get wrong anyway, or at least you were certainly struggling on it, so you had a high likelihood of getting it wrong. If you do come back, that's great. I personally, even me, I got a 175 and I still do this. I'll mark off 3 to 5 questions. I'll flag them and I'll say, you know what? I don't want to deal with this right now. It's too hard. It's too intimidating. I was a poli-sci major, so that humanities are my thing. I see a tough science question, I'm already half likely to skip it. If it's a tough parallel, lengthy parallel question that takes up half the page, I might also want to skip it. If it's a number 9, of course, that's one thing. The method of reasoning might be easy because it's early in the section. There is an order of difficulty there. But questions 20 to 25, those are going to be some of your hardest. And so there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what? I don't want to deal with it right now. Maybe there's an easier question later in the section that I would rather handle, then come back and tackle the tough ones last. Now, how do you have time to tackle the tough ones? You have the time because you build up a time bank. How do you build up the time bank? By blasting through the easy questions. If you're aiming for 160, 165 plus, you've probably got a pretty good foundation. And so if that's your situation, you can blast through the first 10 questions in maybe 10 to 12 minutes. You then build up a time bank of 3 to 5 minutes you can use to, once you've completed the section, go back and tackle the toughest questions that came up along the way. You don't want to be in a position where you're stuck in LSAT quicksand, throwing minute after minute into a question when that investment might not pay off and you're not making any headway. Coming back later can give you a fresh perspective that will apply to give you a new look. It'll make it easier to maybe see the question in a different light, and you can turn that from wrong to right or from a guess into a correct answer. Some of the toughest questions that students typically encounter that they might want to skip, those involving abstract language. Like I said, there's also the parallel questions. Role of statement and flaw questions often involve abstract language as well. And if you're seeing it for the first time, it can take a long time to translate it into something that's more easily comprehensible. And so you can plan for this. You can practice abstract language. You might take a dozen or 24 questions, maybe 50 tough LSAT logical reasoning questions involving this kind of abstract language. Set them aside, and just as an exercise, go through all 5 answer choices for each of those questions and translate. Look up definitions if you don't know what they mean. You can actually parse out the meaning of a phrase in an answer choice, even if it's the wrong answer for that question, so that later when you come across it in the future, you'll immediately know, oh, they're referring to confusing necessary and sufficient conditions, or, oh, they're referring to a personal attack on someone, or circular reasoning, or whatever else it might be. You can learn that now, so that on test day, you're not reinventing the wheel trying to parse or comprehend that text for the first time. Another thing we can talk about now briefly is, okay, well, we said order of difficulty in logical reasoning on average. First 10 questions, maybe 10 to 12 minutes, more time for the tougher questions that come later. There's a general order of difficulty, but not a perfect order of difficulty in logical reasoning. So questions 23 to 25 might actually be slightly easier than 19, 20, and 21. So be it, you come back to the ones in the late teens, early 20s if you need to. If you flagged those, that's fine. I'll briefly touch on games and reasoning though, since that might be a question for you. Games, might be a general order of difficulty as far as all 4 games are concerned. But within a game, you can think about your approach, doing the orientation question first, then the local if questions, and finally the global questions, building your understanding as you go. And with reading comp, something similar yet different, doing the main idea and primary purpose questions, again, the ones that are general in nature, then the local questions that involve line references, giving you an indication of where you might find the answer, and then finally the more general inferential questions that involve reading between the lines. Common mistakes in LSAT logical reasoning. There's a million things that I see students typically make, mistakes they make, but one I can talk about in general is necessary versus sufficient assumption questions. A lot of times they're grouped in a catch-all category of assumption questions, which in my opinion is not a good idea because there's a big difference between them. Necessary assumption questions are asking for more moderate things. They're almost like an inference, something that is required to be true in order for the argument to work. So you can view it as if the stimulus is given, if the argument is assumed to be true, what else must be true? What else is necessary? So in reality, these are not looking for you to strengthen the argument. They're looking for something that is already implicit in the stimulus itself. So we can think about words that indicate this question type versus sufficient assumption in order to properly distinguish between them. Necessary assumption questions contain words or phrases in the question stem that are synonymous with necessity. Words like depends upon, requires, and assumes. On the flip side, we have sufficient assumption questions that are asking for new information that, if true, will guarantee the argument 100%. And in these cases, we're looking for words or phrases in the question stem that are synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, and follows logically if assumed. Again, no need to take notes. This is all on video. You can watch it again at your leisure down the line. Now, It's very important to know the difference between these things because a necessary assumption is not the same as a sufficient assumption 99% of the time. Let's say, for example, you want to go to law school. Let's say you want to go to a law school that requires the LSAT. If you're going to, let's say, the top 50 or top 100 law schools, pretty much all of them require the LSAT or recently the GRE, but that's another story. Anyway, let's say you need to take the LSAT or the GRE in order to go to law school. Taking the LSAT is necessary to go to law school. So someone who's gone to law school necessarily has taken the standardized test required for admission. That is necessary to go to law school, but it's not sufficient. You also need a decent GPA. You also need to complete the application involving a personal statement, letters of recommendation, etc. So all those things are necessary, but each one alone is not sufficient. However, let's say that you got a 180 on the LSAT and a 4.3 GPA and all your parts of your application are outstanding. We could then probably safely say that those things together are sufficient to guarantee admission to a top 14 law school. You don't need a 180 to go to a top 14 law school. Anything in the 170s is probably good enough in combination with other factors. So the 180 alone is not required, but it is, in combination with other factors, sufficient to go to a top law school, most likely. So it's hard to get super concrete with it because in real world settings, because the real world has so many ambiguities and considerations we have to keep in mind. To make it simpler, let's say you want to buy a $1 item. You need to have a penny, the value of a penny, to buy a $1 item, but 1 cent is not enough to buy a $1 item. However, if you had $100, that would be sufficient to buy a $1 item, but that's not required to buy a $1 item. So maybe making it a little more mathematical perhaps made it more clear to you. But anyway, it's very important to tell the difference because 99% of the time, that difference matters. And LSAC is very sneaky about making a tempting wrong answer that is the opposite of what you're looking for. So in other words, a necessary assumption question may include a sufficient assumption as a very tempting wrong answer choice. In fact, they might make that choice A. So you never even get to the correct answer. People commonly, confidently choose the sufficient assumption for a necessary assumption question because they like strong language. So it's almost like it's the right answer to the wrong question. That's not really what they were asking for. So just keep that in mind. I don't want us to get too focused on question stem types and thinking about question types in general, because there's a lot more to it than that. We can also think about the stimulus and the method of reasoning involved in the stimulus. I often hear from students who are in a situation where they're getting lots of questions wrong, but they don't really notice a trend in particular question types. Or they'll say, I'm getting lots of flaw questions wrong and lots of necessary assumption questions wrong. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a particular problem with those question types. You might just be getting them wrong because they appear more frequently than other question types, so you notice it more. So in a way, that's kind of a sampling bias that you might actually see on the LSAT. So be careful of that. The method of reasoning in the stimulus is often more important to understanding why you're getting questions wrong or improving your understanding than question stem types in terms of what you're trying to do, what perspective you're looking at the question from. So we could actually take a given method of reasoning, a given argument, and then apply it to a wide variety of question types. For example, let's say we had an argument that someone's saying, we should go to that restaurant. After all, it has 5 stars on Yelp. So that's an argument. We have the conclusion, we should go to the restaurant, evidence, because they have 5 stars on Yelp. Now, how can we evaluate this? Well, we could strengthen the argument if we said that Yelp reviews are a good indication of whether we should go to a restaurant, or we like the cuisine the restaurant offers. That would also support the idea that we should go there, although it wouldn't directly tie into the evidence. So the best evidence would actually involve, the best way to strengthen the argument would actually involve dealing with the Yelp reviews. So let's say it has 5 stars on Yelp, that's good, but it would strengthen the argument if we learned that it had 1,000 Yelp reviews, or that if we learned that Yelp has a very good filtering mechanism to filter out fake reviews. So a 5-star Yelp rating actually is indicative of a restaurant's quality if the reviews are real. We could weaken the argument if we said, oh, Yelp is not good at filtering fake reviews, most of the reviews are fake. Or if we learned that, yeah, it has 5 stars, but the reviews are actually all from the owner's friends and family who may be biased. Or if we learned that we don't actually like that cuisine, that would weaken the case for going there. If we learned that let's say someone was saying, the restaurant has 5-star reviews on Yelp, however, we should not go there. Explain this situation or resolve that paradox. It would help if we learned that, well, Yelp reviews are not reliable. It would help us evaluate the argument if we learned the extent to which Yelp reviews are a good indicator of whether we should go to a restaurant. So there are lots of angles from which we can approach a given argument, but thoroughly understanding the relationship between evidence and conclusion will ultimately be core. It'll be central to improving your understanding. Now, before we sign off for now, there is one other thing I want to talk about, which is properly reviewing LSAT questions. I can't stress enough how important it is to review LSAT problems you're having trouble with or having difficulty with or getting wrong versus just doing more and more timed practice exams. What you want to do when you're reviewing questions is anything you had difficulty with or anything you got wrong, I want you to look at what was tempting about the wrong answer choice that made you pick it and what ultimately makes it wrong, and what's discouraging about the right answer that pushes you away from it, and what ultimately makes it correct in the end. You want to do this over and over painstakingly, saving a file of every question you've ever had difficulty with or gotten wrong so that later you can review those again and again and again until on several different attempts you will be solid in your understanding and getting it right every single time. If you like, one thing you can do is you can make photocopies of your books, or you can take photos of LSAT problems for your own personal use. I think that's okay. And then you can reprint them to have multiple attempts with clean copies. That's a great way to handle it, to have multiple pass-throughs to really see, are you getting it right timed? Are you getting it right untimed? And are you getting it right consistently on multiple attempts? Evaluating your thought process so that you can be confident that your analysis is correct and you're choosing the right answer for the right reasons. LSAT explanations are great. They're very useful. I learned a lot from my own process of writing them, and so I encourage you to do the same. And of course, you can look up explanations online. I have a YouTube channel and written materials covering them, but don't use them as a crutch. Your own personal review process will be the most valuable thing of all. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. Please feel free to reach out if you need anything at all. I love hearing from students. Happy to help however I can. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do so. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast yet, LSAT Unplugged, please do that as well. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.